The German Shepherd stood near the gate, not barking, not moving, just watching with eyes that seemed to know things, eyes that had seen things and yet hoped for something, as if he had waited in that very spot before, as if he had counted the passing days by the shifting faces of children who never stopped long enough to see him. But this girl saw everything. Her name was Emily, and she had always been different from the other children in ways no one could really explain, not even her parents, who often found her watching clouds or talking to birds or picking up fallen leaves like they were treasure maps. And in this moment, as the bell rang and dozens of students poured out into the world beyond the gate, Emily did not run. She did not talk, she simply looked at the dog, and the dog looked back. He was big, much bigger than any dog she had ever been close to, with a body built strong and firm, but not threatening, not dangerous. His tail did not wag, but it did not stand stiff either. His ears twitched slightly when she took a small step forward, her backpack heavy against her shoulders. Her breath caught between curiosity and caution, and she wondered why he looked so calm, so still, like he belonged to someone who had taught him love. He did not wear anything fancy, no bright colored leash, no shiny tag, no sweater like some of the neighborhood dogs, just an old worn brown leather collar that hung slightly loose around his neck, the kind that told stories in its cracks and creases, like an old shoe that had traveled far through mud and rain, and maybe even snow. She squinted at it, hoping to read something, but the letters were faded, too faded. Still, she stayed there staring, and he stared back, and it was not a staring contest, it was something deeper, like a question being asked without words, and maybe an answer being given without sound, because Emily began to understand somehow, without really knowing how, that this dog had been waiting not for food, not for shelter, not even for help, but for someone to notice him, truly notice him, the way she always wished someone would notice her. A cold wind passed through the street, and she pulled her scarf up around her chin and took one more step. This time the dog did not flinch. He blinked slowly and shifted his weight just enough for her to see the side of the collar where the leather curled slightly and revealed the edge of something metal. She leaned in closer, her fingers trembling with a mix of fear and excitement, and there it was, a tag, scratched and rusted, almost completely unreadable except for three things: a number 7, and something that looked like part of a phone number, or maybe a name, and for reasons she did not understand. Tears came to her eyes, because suddenly this was not just a dog sitting by a gate, this was a mystery, a question, a piece of someone's heart left behind, waiting for the right pair of eyes to find it. And Emily knew right then that she was not going to walk away. Emily stood in front of the dog, her breath fogging the air, as the late afternoon sun dipped behind the school roof and painted the sky in quiet shades of orange and gold. The dog had not moved except for his eyes, which followed her every step, calm and steady, like he had already decided she was safe, or maybe he just no longer cared what came next. She slowly sat down on the cold concrete near the gate, careful to keep space between them, not wanting to scare him away, not wanting him to think she wanted to capture him or chase him, because somehow she knew he would run if she moved too fast, and she did not want him to run, not now, not ever. The other children laughed and shouted and ran past them without looking, too caught up in their own worlds to notice what was happening right there beside them. But Emily stayed still, her legs folded under her arms, her eyes locked on the collar that had started this whole thing, and the dog tilted his head just a little, as if trying to figure her out. She whispered hello, not knowing why, since he could not answer, but she did it anyway, and the moment the word left her lips, the dog's ears lifted slightly, and something flickered in his eyes, maybe memory, maybe recognition, maybe just hope, but it was something, and it mattered, because it told Emily she was right to stay. She inched forward on her knees just enough to see more of the tag, and she reached into her coat pocket for a small piece of paper folded and crumpled from her math test earlier that day. She smoothed it out against the sidewalk and pulled a pencil from her sleeve, where she always kept one tucked like a secret weapon, and she began to write down every mark she could see on the collar. The letters were barely there, almost erased by time and weather and worry, but she could make out what looked like a C and an A, maybe the beginning of a name or a place, and the number 7 was clear, followed by a 3 and a 9 and maybe a 2 or an 8, she could not be sure. But she wrote it all anyway, just in case, because something inside her said this was important. The dog shifted again, his paw scraping the sidewalk, and for a moment he looked away, as if searching for something down the street, something far and familiar. And it broke Emily's heart a little, because that look was not a lost look, it was a longing one, the kind of look people gave when they remembered someone they missed more than anything. She looked down at the numbers on the page, and then back at the dog, and then stood up slowly, her knees stiff, her backpack dragging against her side, and she made a promise right there in her mind she would find out where he belonged. She would not let this dog stay forgotten, not if she could help it. And as she took one last look at him before heading home, the dog gently lay down, resting his head on his paws, like he somehow knew that help had finally arrived. Emily walked home with the scrap of paper held tightly in her hand, her fingers nearly numb from the cold, but she barely noticed the wind or the fading light or the ache in her shoulders from the heavy bag. She only thought about the dog, about His eyes about that strange mix of strength and sadness that followed her even after she turned the corner and lost sight of him. She burst through the door without her usual quiet steps, startling her mother, who dropped a spoon onto the kitchen floor and asked what in the world had gotten into her, but Emily did not answer right away. She reached for the phone on the counter and unfolded the paper carefully like it was something precious and rare, like a secret message sent only to her. Father came in from the other room, curious about the sudden storm of movement, and stood beside her watching as she began to dial a number. Even though she wasn't sure if it was complete or correct, her hands shook and she kept glancing at the paper, checking and rechecking the faded numbers, hoping they would somehow make sense. The phone rang once, then twice, then a third time, and just as she was about to hang up, a voice answered, rough and tired, the kind of voice that carried years inside it, and Emily froze for a second, unsure of what to say. Then she took a breath and spoke softly, saying she had found a dog near her school, a German shepherd with a worn collar and a tag that might have said Carl. There was silence on the line, so heavy it felt like something breaking slowly. Then the man on the other end spoke, his voice cracking as he asked her to describe the dog again, and Emily did every detail she could remember, from the dark stripe down his back to the way he sat so still, like he was guarding something invisible. The man did not speak again for several seconds, and when he did, he only said one word, Max. Then he asked her to repeat the location where she saw him, and she did, her voice small but clear, and the man said, thank you, not like people say when you pass them the salt, but the kind of thank you that makes your chest ache, like someone just breathed for the first time in days. Emily gave him her name and he gave her his. He was Carl, and Max had been missing for over a month after slipping through a broken fence during a thunderstorm, and Carl had searched every day with flyers and phone calls and quiet prayers, and had started to believe he would never see Max again. She told him the dog had not moved from the spot, and that he looked like he was waiting, and Carl said that sounded just like him, and that he would come right away if she could show him where. She nodded even though he could not see her, and hung up the phone slowly, her heart pounding like she had just unlocked something deep and old and important, something more than just a lost dog. And outside the window the last light of day faded, and Emily stood in the glow of the hallway, knowing tomorrow would not be ordinary. Not anymore. The next morning Emily woke up before her alarm, before the sun had fully risen, before the birds outside her window had begun their usual chatter, and for the first time in a long time she jumped out of bed with a purpose, her feet barely touching the floor as she rushed to get dressed, her mind filled with the image of the dog waiting by the school gate like a soldier on duty. Her parents were still sleepy when she came downstairs, her mother blinking at her from behind a cup of coffee, and her father asking if she had forgotten it was Saturday. But Emily shook her head and grabbed a piece of toast. Without slowing down she told them quickly about Carl, about Max, about the plan to meet, and her mother's face softened in a way that meant she understood this mattered deeply. They agreed to drive her instead of letting her walk, and by the time they reached the corner near the school, Emily was already pressing her face to the window, scanning the sidewalk, her eyes darting between shadows and parked cars. And then there he was, exactly where she had left him, as if he had not moved even once during the long cold night. Her mother parked slowly, and Emily jumped out before the car had fully stopped, her boots crunching against the pavement as she hurried over to him. She expected him to look tired or scared, but he looked calm, maybe even a little proud, as if he had known she would come back, and somehow that made her eyes fill with tears. She sat beside him again, and this time he moved just a little, inching closer, his head leaning ever so slightly in her direction, and she reached out with one hand, letting it hover in the air, not wanting to rush him, but hoping he would trust her. And after a moment that felt like forever, he did. His nose touched her palm, warm and gentle, and she smiled so wide it hurt. A car turned the corner and rolled to a stop slowly behind her. It was old and silver, with a dent in the front bumper, and a man stepped out carefully, his coat too big for his thin frame, his hands trembling not from cold but from something deeper, something that had been broken and suddenly dared to hope. Emily stood up and pointed and said softly, he is right here. And the man named Carl looked over, and for one brief moment he did not move, his face frozen like someone afraid they were about to wake up from a beautiful dream. Then he whispered Max, not loudly but with every piece of his soul behind it. The dog lifted his head, his ears perked, and his whole body seemed to come alive in a single heartbeat. Then he stood and looked straight at the man, and everything around them went quiet, the cars, the wind, the city itself holding its breath as the dog took one step, then another, then broke into a run. And when Max reached him he leapt into his arms like no time had passed, like no miles had come between them, like nothing in the world could ever break them apart again. Carl knelt on the ground as Max buried his face into the folds of the old man's coat, his tail wagging not wildly but with deep slow certainty, the kind of movement that comes not from excitement but from recognition, from peace, from finding something you thought was gone forever. And Carl wrapped his arms around the dog as tightly as his frail body would let him, his fingers digging into Max's fur like he was trying to hold time itself. Still he did not speak for a long time, just held Max there, In the cold morning light, while Emily stood a few steps away watching quietly, not wanting to interrupt the moment, because even at 9 years old she knew when something sacred was happening, she knew when something had been broken and then made whole again. Right before her eyes finally, Carl looked up, his eyes red and tired, but also shining in a way they had not in a very long time, and he looked at Emily like she was something he had not expected to find in this world, like a miracle that had walked out of the fog and handed him his heart back. And he said thank you again, this time barely above a whisper, but filled with more meaning than 100 loud words. He told her how Max had been with him since he was a pup, how they had gone through everything together, the loss of his wife, the quiet days, the hard winters, how Max had been more than a dog, he had been his companion, his reason to get up in the morning, his family. And when Max disappeared one night during a storm, he had searched every block, every alley, every shelter, and still had come home each night to an empty yard and a quiet house. Emily listened closely, her heart full and aching at the same time, and she looked at Max, who now stood calmly at Carl's side, like a soldier returned to duty, as if all was right again in the order of things. And she felt something deep inside her, something steady and warm, like she had helped the world shift just a little closer to where it was supposed to be. Carl said he did not live far and asked if they would like to come with him for a moment just to visit, and Emily looked at her parents who had been watching from the car, and they nodded with quiet smiles. So she climbed into the back seat with Max, who pressed close to her and rested his head in her lap as if to say thank you in the only way he knew how. When they arrived at Carl's house, it was small and neat and filled with old photographs and soft rugs and the scent of something comforting, and Carl showed them a framed picture of Max as a puppy, and Emily laughed softly at how different and yet the same he looked. And Max walked from room to room like he was finally awake again, finally home. And as Carl poured tea for her parents and brought out a plate of cookies for Emily, he looked over at her and said, you brought my boy back, and I will never forget that, not for as long as I live. The next few weeks unfolded like a quiet story that only a few people knew about, a story written not with loud events or grand speeches, but with small moments, with soft footsteps and steady visits, with the kind of kindness that moves slowly and settles deeply into the heart. Emily began walking to Carl's house every Sunday afternoon, just a few blocks from her own, and every Sunday Max would be waiting at the gate, sitting tall and still, just like the day she first saw him outside the school. It became their ritual. Max would see her from the window and bark once, not out of alarm but recognition. Then he would run to the door and Carl would follow, not as fast as the dog, but always with a smile that never seemed to fade, and they would sit together in the small living room where the afternoon light poured in through lace curtains, while Carl poured tea and offered cookies and told stories that seemed too good to be true but somehow always felt real. When he told them, he spoke of his younger years, how he met his wife at a bookstore, how she used to sing to Max when he was just a pup, how the dog would curl beside the fireplace on winter nights and stay there for hours without moving, like he was made of stone and fire. At the same time, Emily listened carefully to every word, sometimes nodding, sometimes asking questions, but mostly just being there because she knew Carl needed that more than anything. Max always sat beside her during these visits, his head on her lap or his paw resting gently on her shoe, and sometimes he would make small sounds, not barks, but little whines, like he was remembering too. And when Carl would pause during a story to wipe his eyes, Max would lift his head just enough to press his nose into his hand, a gesture so soft it made Emily's throat ache. One Sunday Carl handed Emily a framed picture. It was one he had taken years ago when Max was still young, running across a field, ears flying, tongue out, joy captured in midair. And he said, I want you to have this because you saw him when no one else did. You saw him not just with your eyes, but with your heart, and that kind of seeing is rare and precious. Emily held the frame tightly, unsure what to say, so she only smiled and nodded and said thank you, because sometimes words were not enough, and Carl seemed to understand that too. He looked at her like she was a granddaughter he had never expected, and Max looked at her like she was something safe, something permanent. The neighborhood began to notice their bond. Children who once ran past Max now stopped to pet him. Parents smiled when they saw Carl walking with Emily and the dog between them like a living bridge, and even the people at the corner store began to leave out treats behind the counter just in case Max stopped by. And through it all, Emily never asked for anything in return, never treated Max like a prize or Carl like a project. She simply came back every week with quiet footsteps and a gentle smile, and Max always met her at the gate like he had been counting the minutes since the last time she left, because somehow, without trying, without knowing how, she had become his person too. Autumn turned to winter in a slow, quiet way. The leaves faded from gold to brown and the wind grew sharper and colder, but nothing about the Sundays changed. Emily still walked the same path to Carl's house, her scarf wrapped tight around her neck and her gloved hands carrying whatever small thing she had brought that day. Sometimes it was a drawing she had made of Max running through the field, sometimes it was a slice of her mother's pie tucked into foil, and sometimes it was just herself and her time, and that always seemed to be more than enough. Carl waited by the window just like Max did, now both of them growing more familiar with the shape of Emily's walk and the sound of her boots on the porch steps. Max would jump up before she even knocked, and Carl would open the door before her hand could touch the wood, and the three of them would step into the little house where the heater hummed and the light fell soft through the windows and the world outside seemed far away. Max had changed since that first day Emily had met him. His eyes no longer held that quiet ache, that distant waiting. Instead, they shone with alertness and trust and something that looked very much like joy. He followed Emily from room to room, rested his head in her lap when she read out loud, and nudged her gently with his nose if she ever looked sad even for a moment. Carl noticed it too, and he said once with a laugh that Max seemed younger these days, like time had slowed down for him just to enjoy her company a little longer. Carl himself seemed lighter too. He walked with more ease, and his stories came more freely, and his laughter, which had once sounded like something broken, now rang out fully, as if it had remembered how to be whole. Again, he often spoke of things from long ago, stories that held both joy and sorrow, but now he always ended them with something hopeful, and each time he did he would glance at Emily with a kind of wonder, like he still could not quite believe she had come into his life. One Sunday Carl brought out an old box from a hallway closet, dust covering the top, and inside were photos and collars and little mementos of a life lived mostly in quiet company. Max had been the last of 3 dogs, and Carl had kept something from each of them, names stitched into fabric, tags clipped to faded collars. Emily looked through them with care, asking about each one, and Carl told her their names and habits and what they loved and how they were all different, and yet all had shared one thing, the way they had loved without question. Emily asked why he kept everything, and Carl said, because remembering is a kind of love too, and Max rested his chin on the edge of the box as if he knew that was true. And Emily thought then that maybe love did not always need to shout or shine, maybe sometimes it just needed to stay. The snow began to fall that evening as Emily and her parents got ready to leave, and Max followed her to the door, his paw lifting slightly as if to ask when she would come back, and she knelt beside him and whispered, "I'll see you next week, like always," and kissed the top of his head. And Carl stood behind them, both smiling softly, because in this small quiet life something beautiful had been restored, and they all knew it without needing to say a single word. Spring arrived, slowly brushing away the last of the snow and waking the trees with shy green buds, and Emily felt the change not just outside but deep inside her chest, like something that had been waiting was finally ready to bloom. She still walked to Carl's house every Sunday, the rhythm of their visits a steady heartbeat in a world that often felt too fast and too loud. Carl no longer needed to look out the window to wait for her. He would be standing at the door with a smile that reached his eyes, and Max would be pacing eagerly beside him. The old dog, who had once been lost, now seemed to have found not just a home but a purpose, something like happiness that shone quietly through his thick fur and bright eyes. Emily noticed how Carl's steps grew firmer, and how Max's tail wagged with more energy, and how the house itself seemed warmer, filled with laughter and stories that spilled like sunlight through the rooms. And sometimes, when Carl told a story about his wife, Emily could see the tears in his eyes, but they were different now, not heavy with grief but soft with memory and love. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the light turned golden, Carl pulled out a small notebook and handed it to Emily. Inside were pages filled with poems he had written over the years, some long and others short, and all of them about Max, about love, about loss, and about hope. Emily flipped through the pages with awe, and Carl said, "You inspired me to write again, to believe again, to see that life can still hold beautiful things even when it feels like it might break." And Emily felt her heart swell, because she had never thought of herself as someone who could change a life, but here she was, a quiet girl with a brave heart who had done just that. Max lay at her feet, his breathing even and calm, and Carl looked at the dog and then at Emily and said, "You saved him, but you saved me too." And Emily smiled shyly, because sometimes the smallest things can make the biggest difference. The story of the girl and the dog and the man became a quiet legend in their neighborhood, a story told softly over fences and at dinner tables, a reminder that sometimes all it takes is one pair of eyes to see what others do not, and one heart willing to reach out and hold on. Emily grew older, and her visits to Carl's house continued long after she was no longer a little girl, but even then Max would wait at the gate, and Carl would greet her with that same smile and the same quiet gratitude that never needed words. And when Max finally grew too old to run and play, and when Carl's steps slowed with time, Emily was still there, sitting beside them, holding their hands and holding their stories, and knowing that love in its simplest form can heal even the deepest wounds and light the darkest nights, because some bonds are made not by blood but by moments of kindness and courage and the willingness to notice the small and forgotten things. And Emily had done all that and more. And so the German shepherd and the little girl and the man with a broken heart all found a way to be whole again, not because life was perfect but because they chose to believe in second chances and the power of seeing and being seen. And that is how A little girl changed a German shepherd's life and a man's too, all with nothing more than a look, a collar, and a heart willing to care.